From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Gerald Feierstein, Director of Policy Programs and Government Relations at the Middle East Institute, filling in this week for Paul Salem. Hopes for progress in resolving the ongoing civil conflict in Yemen were disappointed last month when the Houthis, one of the key parties to the conflict, refused to participate in meetings to be hosted by UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths in Geneva. The last-minute rejection left Griffiths scrambling to re-engage and try again. In the meantime, the situation on the ground around Hodeidah, the main port of entry for supplies to 75% of Yemen's population, is unchanged after the launching last spring of a much-anticipated offensive by the Saudi-led coalition backed by a melange of Yemeni forces. Successful transfer of the Hodeidah port from the Houthis, either militarily or through a negotiated handover, had been identified as a potential game-changer to support the UN negotiation strategy. Where do we go from here on Yemen? Do these twin setbacks mean that the stalemate in Yemen is likely to persist for years longer? What's the impact of these developments on the civilian population in Yemen, often described as confronting the world's worst humanitarian crisis? The Middle East Institute is hosting a conference on Yemen this week to address these and other questions. I'm delighted to welcome to today's podcast Marcia Biggs, who will be participating in the conference. Marcia is a freelance journalist who recently completed a very highly regarded 4-part series titled Inside Yemen, which aired on the PBS network. Marcia, welcome to Middle East Focus.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You were in Yemen for your series earlier this year in the spring. And could you describe a little bit what you saw, what you heard while you were there?
So I spent the majority of my time, or all of my time, in areas of the south. I didn't go into the Houthi-controlled areas, but preferred to stay in the south and interviewed those who were fleeing areas like Hodeidah. And what I found was that hundreds of thousands of IDPs coming from that area are descending upon the south, and they may be finding an area that is safe from airstrikes and that has a bit more food availability. But while food may be available, the economy is in such tatters that it's not sustainable for people. People can't afford food. So they leave an area where they're starving and they're fleeing bombing to another area where they may not be bombs, but they're still starving. And they have real no hope for future, for opportunities. I found pretty much a failed state. I found an area where trash piles up in the streets, sewage, people really feel no hope about the economy. They blame the government. I went to a market where people were talking about food prices having doubled in the last 3 months. When I was there in March and April, there were 500 rials to the dollar. Now it's more like 800. So it can only have gotten worse. I found a situation where the medical sector was in tatters, and every hospital I went into, there was some child suffering complications of severe acute malnutrition. And the word SAM, which is the acronym for severe acute malnutrition, is so commonly used that people don't even know what it stands for. They just know this child has SAM and this child is dying. And, hospital workers talked about putting a Band-Aid on the situation, giving them an IV, giving them supplements, getting them, stabilized, and then sending them back out into an environment where they're almost certain to not find enough food to survive. So it was a really, really bleak trip, a really bleak vision. And I don't see, no matter what, talks are happening, whether talks are successful or unsuccessful, for now, I don't see really much changing in the South because it is not the war zone per se. It is where people flee from the war zone. And there's not much hope there either.
So let me ask you, and this is an important point because where you were was an area of the country which is at least officially considered to be A, in the hands of the government, and B, under the control of the coalition. And of course, we've heard over these past years from both the Saudis and the Emiratis about the huge amount of humanitarian assistance they're providing, the food, the medicine. The Saudis often refer to, $9 or $10 billion in humanitarian assistance that they've sent to the country. They've put billions of dollars into the central bank of Yemen to try to stabilize the economy. And yet the situation that you're describing seems to suggest that there's really no visible impact on the street for all of this assistance that's coming in. So where do you think, what were people saying to you about the explanation for this apparent failure on the part of the coalition to actually change the situation on the ground?
Well, I wonder where that cash is going, because if the rial to the dollar was 500, now it's 800. I don't quite understand where all that cash has gone. People on the street blame corruption, and whether they blame the government or whether they blame the coalition, they feel that corruption is king, and they're the ones who are suffering. That's what I found. I also, when I went to hospitals and I interviewed doctors and nurses there, I went into one, little supply room, and the woman who was there with me pointed to everything, and she said, she pointed to various goods that were, donated by various aid organizations. And I said, well, what would you have if this were just run by the Ministry of Health? And she looked at me and she said, nothing. Empty place, empty. So at the same time, she doesn't know what's going to come next month. And, as the heat was starting to rise and we were getting closer to summer, they were very concerned about electricity problems. At that time, they were running on the generator and they were doing okay. I was in a pediatric ward and the incubators were running. But I said, what about tomorrow? And they said, I have no idea. Who knows? So again, the Yemenis that I spoke to feel that there are Band-Aids put on the situation, but that there's no real hope for a sustainable future. And in terms of the coalition, I would say people really feel the weight of the coalition's footprint in southern Yemen, which is what I can speak to. I spoke to the relatives of those who are detained in prisons, and they're desperate to find out any information about their sons and their fathers and their brothers, and say that they don't even have the right to go to the coalition to find out the answers to these questions, to find out where they are, how long they'll be held. Et cetera, et cetera. So, I asked the Emirati foreign minister, the question the other day, what is the plan for handing over back sovereignty to the Yemeni government? Because I also spoke to the interior minister of Yemen, who said, we have no control over the port. We have no control over our airspace. We have no control over the prisons. I'm interior minister and I have no control over the prisons. What is this? And I said, is this an occupation? And he kind of laughed and wouldn't really answer it, but said, everything on the ground supports what you just said, and maybe I'll say this at some point. So I asked the Emirati interior minister, what is your plan for handing back sovereignty? And he essentially answered that they can't trust the Yemeni government to handle these ministries, like the sewage problem and the education problem. They cannot trust the Yemeni government to handle these. But I, as someone who was on the ground a few months ago, am wondering what they are doing about these issues.
Well, one of the aspects of this, of course, that plays into the long-term prospects of rebuilding a stable and secure Yemen is the extent to which this contributes to the separatist movement in Yemen. We just saw today that the Southern Transition Council, which has had a relationship with the UAE in the past, has issued new statements challenging the central government, the Hadi government, saying again that they were going to be looking at beginning a separation movement, taking peaceful protests out on the streets. So you were in contact with some of the people who are associated with or follow the lead of this Southern Transition Council. What were they saying to you? What was their view about not only the central government, but also about the coalition?
As I said before, they believe that the central government is corrupt and, they are supported by the Emiratis. So obviously there's a relationship there. But I think that what needs to be addressed is how the coalition and the Yemeni government and the southern separatists can come together to try to create some kind of a stable and sustainable environment in southern Yemen. I mean, at this stage, it is a failed state. So nobody seems to be in charge.
Right. So when Martin Griffiths resumes, and one of the issues that he was trying to grapple with before the September 6th effort in Geneva, one of the issues was whether or not he should try to have a negotiation or a consultation that addressed only the principal parties to the dispute, in other words, the Hadi government and the Houthis, or should he try to expand the aperture, include Southerners, include some of these other elements that have felt perhaps over the last 3 years that their views, their positions weren't really addressed in the various UN initiatives. What's your sense going forward? Do you think if there is a successful negotiation between the government and the Houthis that brings an end to the fighting, would that satisfy some of these issues? Or do you think that the situation in the South has deteriorated to the point where really none of that is going to matter?
Well, I think a Southern separatist movement is separate from what you're seeing in the north with the Houthis. So I think even if there were negotiations that brought complete and total peace between the Houthis and the coalition, you're still going to have that problem of the South. So many of the Southerners that I spoke to really don't even consider themselves the same people as those who are dealing with this in the north. I mean, this struck me because I would ask people, oh, your people are starving, your people are being bombed in the north. And, there was sympathy for them, but not a real connection in terms of it being our people. So no matter what happens with the Houthis, you're still going to have this problem with a section of the South that wants to be separate from the north.
You had mentioned that there are many people, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people who've come from the north to the south to flee from the actual fighting. In the past, there's been tension between northerners and southerners, southerners in particular who saw or felt that the north was invading their territory, that they were being absorbed, almost colonized by people coming out of northern Yemen. Did you get a sense when you were talking to people that those same kind of regional conflicts were there, or have people accepted that these are fellow Yemenis who are trying to seek safe haven?
I mean, I can't speak to everyone, but the people that I met, whether they considered them their people or a different kind of their people, or a people that are further north and our neighbors, regardless of how they categorize them, I found a generous and gracious and hospitable community that was trying to absorb the hundreds of thousands of people fleeing devastation. That being said, for those people fleeing, it's still very difficult. There are no formal settlements for Yemenis escaping the conflict. There are for others, for Eritreans and Somalians, but there are no formal settlements for Yemenis. So they're just being absorbed into the communities. And again, people are being gracious and generous, but it's difficult to absorb that many people. And I did go to some camps, informal camps, where people were putting together dwellings with sticks and some corrugated metal, and they were using the bushes several hundred yards away as their latrine. And no one was really managing those quote unquote camps. People were delivering food to them, but they never really knew when that food was going to come. They couldn't really rely on it. So I understand why there are those who believe that there shouldn't be formal camps, because it is very difficult to then absorb into the local community. But at the same time, there are definitely those who are falling through the cracks.
So let me ask you an unfair question.
Oh, no.
And maybe all of these questions have been unfair, but looking forward then and thinking about what you've seen, what do you think is the correct way forward? How should the UN try to advance the prospect of resolving this conflict and addressing the needs of those people that you saw?
That definitely is an unfair question. And the fact that you're saying, how should the UN go forward? As if there isn't the rest of the international community that could put some pressure on those parties who are committing war crimes. We are all complicit if we say nothing. And I think it's the same in Syria. It's the same in Yemen. It's the same in every place where civilians are the number one victims of these political, geopolitical, regional conflicts that are playing out between only a few major parties, but everyone else is suffering. So I think we can't look away. I mean, Yemen has, in the news for sure, kind of fallen on the wayside, and it is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. There are war crimes being committed by both parties. There are children being recruited to fight. There are, indiscriminate bombings of civilians. So we all need to speak out, not just the UN. I mean, the UN has a huge role to play, but I don't think any of us can just sit back and say, oh, well, the UN needs to take care of it. That's not typically worked so well.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I certainly agree with you that the U.S. should be more actively engaged, and hopefully that will be another issue that we'll be able to explore in our conference today.
Well, the U.S. is actively engaged, but perhaps it needs to look at how it's engaged and how it can be engaged or disengaged further, just with the right agenda in mind.
Right. Well, I meant engaged in support of a political solution.
Yes.
Right? Yes. Well, I want to thank you on that.
Sorry, was that an unfair answer?
No. There's no such thing as an unfair answer, only an unfair question. I want to thank Marcia Biggs for joining us today. The conference today will be posted on the MEI website. I invite all of our listeners to tune in, and we're delighted that Marcia is going to be moderating a panel that's going to look specifically really at some of the reconstruction and humanitarian issues related to the Yemen crisis. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this program, please be sure to subscribe and share it with your friends. You can send us comments on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.